everyone, and welcome back to Quilt 101, our beginner quilting series. Today is lesson 6, and what we're going to talk about today is putting our beautiful blocks that we made in lesson 5, putting them together in a quilt top. Now if we look at the sample behind us, we can see that those blocks aren't just simply sewn together. They have a sashing and some sashing squares. And so we're also going to go back to our pattern. We're going to go back to our cutting instructions and revisit those. And we'll talk a little bit about sizing and resizing and just getting ready, picking our fabrics and getting ready to put all our quilt top back together or together for the first time. I'm very excited about it. So all my blocks are done. I hope all of your blocks are done. And if you're ready, let's get started. All right, let's go back to our book here for a moment, because in our book, when we started this whole series, we started just with fabric A and fabric B, which are the two fabrics that we needed to make our 9-patch blocks. Now, the reason that we only focused on fabric A and fabric B is because if you are a beginner, sometimes when you start and we're just learning about our 1/4-inch seam or sewing our straight lines, our blocks can actually finish at a different size. So in general, when you have a quilt pattern, you're going to start with a quilt pattern that has some cutting instructions or the properties of the things that you're going to need, usually on the back of the pattern, or if it's in a book, somewhere in the beginning of the pattern is going to have the fabric requirements. That's how we're going to know each and every piece of fabric that we need to have. We also, if it's a project that has a zipper or it has some stabilizers and things like that, those are all going to be listed. And some of those options, some of those items are going to be mandatory to finish the quilt the way that it is pictured, and some are going to be optional. And so it's really important that we know all the differences of that. And at the beginning of this series, I gave you all of the details of the things that we're going to need throughout the series, including the backing and the batting that you're going to need to finish your quilt. I didn't tell you to cut anything. And so when we got to our lesson, I think it was lesson 4, we did all of our cutting for our fabric A and fabric B. And we were very specific just to stop there. And the thing is, all of those cutting instructions are in the beginning of the quilt, right in the beginning of the pattern. And a lot of people like to get into it when you start quilting and you're doing quilting a long time. It's like, you know what, I like to just get all the cutting done out of the way. I can set that stuff aside. It depends on the type of quilter you are. So there are projects that I do where I like to have everything cut out ahead of time. If you're following the channel at all, I did a temperature quilt in 2024. And in the temperature quilt, I cut as I went. And that was very specific because it was all about temperature, and we didn't know what our temperatures were going to be and how in my zone, whether the scale of temperature was going to mean that I was going to overuse one color and underuse another color. So I cut as I went, and that became a habit that we did throughout that series in 2024. And in 2025, we're doing a 100 block series. So as I'm doing each block in different color, I'm just cutting the block ahead of time, and I'm not really cutting ahead in the series at all. So that's something that, you know, depending on the project, you're going to want to do. So some people like to just cut little sections, and that way they don't get all their parts confused. So in the beginning, what I wanted you to concentrate on were the parts that you needed for what you were working on at the time, because a lot of times we get all this cutting done and we get lots and lots and lots of cutting, we never get to the sewing, and we can lose those parts, or we can get confused on which parts they are, which is why we organize and label. So the second reason that I didn't have you cut any of the other parts ahead of time is simply because when you are a beginner, as you're learning about your straight stitching and as you're learning about your 1/4-inch seam, those parts, those blocks, could wind up being a larger size or a smaller size than what you need. And as evident by our last video in lesson 5, when I needed to readjust my 1/4-inch seam, that can happen. So in my case, my block was about 1/8 of an inch too small, and that is exactly common. So there's nothing to feel bad about. You can see I'm still I'm holding my head pretty high about it. So I'm not concerned about that part. But if you are having trouble with that, or if you're finding that you're very, very consistent with your seam allowances, but they're just a ½ inch bigger than everything else. So it takes time to really get into the feel of where that 1/4 inch seam is, how the pressing's gonna go. It does take some time. So because this is our quilt and we can make adjustments as we go along in our quilt, I only had you concentrate on the parts that you needed for part A, part B, so you could get your blocks together. And the intention is then, when we're ready to cut our sashing, we can adjust the sashing as needed, if need be, to the size of your blocks. So you can imagine if I had you go through and I had you cut, if our squares were supposed to be 12.5 inches and I asked you to cut a whole bunch of 12.5 inch strips, right? So they would fit on the side of that. If your blocks wound up being 12 inches on accident, then you'd have to go take each one of those strips and cut them down by ½ inch. If your blocks measured 12 3/4, you would have a whole bunch of strips you couldn't use because they're a 1/4 inch too small. So if we measure everything when you're done and we are confident that we know the common measurement of those blocks, then we know what size to cut those strips and everything will fit together, and you won't feel as though, as you're trying to put your quilt together, that you've done something incorrect, because there's nothing worse than cutting something wrong and having to go buy more fabric, or having to take the time to cut it down, or just having a problem. Anytime you have a problem, it can really derail your ability to get back into your project, and we don't want to do that. So today we're going to cut, measure and cut those strips, those sashing strips, so that everything will fit together the way you're sewing it. So that's how we're going to do it today. So let's take a look back at our book. So in our book, we have our sashing strips, which are going to be our fabric C. And I know sometimes it can be very confusing because it says from the navy print. You may not be using a navy print. And we have fabric D, which is our green solid. So our fabric C are these skinny strips here in between the blocks, which we call our sashing. And these little green squares here, which are admittedly on this camera probably very close to what we have here in the yellow. So these squares are going to fit right in between these strips. So the strips themselves have to be cut exactly the width of the block. So that's what we're going to concentrate on now. We only need, for these little greens, we only needed a 6-inch square of green because we only need 4 of those. Those are 2.5 inches. And then we're going to cut our strips, our 2.5 inch strips for our sashing, and we're going to cut our strip sets, our actual sashing strips, to size. So let's take a look at our quilt first off. So our quilt behind me is our sample. I'm going to go ahead and take that down because all of my blocks and strips are behind it. So now that I've removed our sample quilt, you can see I have the blocks that I need to make this quilt. And then I have another little bit of a surprise for you, which is, we have in our pattern, we were supposed to make 9 squares. And I don't know if you can see, but just below my last row here, I have another row. So I have 2 quilts happening right now. And the first quilt is exactly the same size as the sample. It's already been partially pieced. And then I have my new sample that we're working on now. And I decided, instead of having it be a square quilt that is 3 blocks by 3 blocks, I wanted it to be a little more oblong. And I've created a 3 block by 4 block setting. And I kind of did that on purpose because I do want to walk you through making this quilt, but I also want to walk you through a couple of steps that might be different. If for some reason you find a quilt and you decide, you know what, I can just make a couple more blocks. I have some extra fabric and I want to make a few more blocks. And what does that mean for my sashing and my borders? So we're going to do that together for both quilts. And that way we can get an idea of what we're going to do each step. So the quilt that we have that is a 3 by 4 setting is the one that's here on the wall. And then I also have my original black and white quilt with my butterflies on the outside. And we're going to use that one to show you the 3 by 3. Okay, so that way one quilt will look exactly like what I hope you're doing. and one will have a few challenges and changes, okay? So the first thing that I did was I took all of my blocks and I measured them with my square, which you saw in the last lesson. We measured with our square to make sure they were all the same size. Now mine, after my fix, all of my squares measured at 12.5 inches, so I was very grateful for that. That might not be the case for you, and that's all right. So if you have blocks that are consistently the same size, as we said, if they're consistently 1/4 inch too big and they're all 12 3/4, well, that's okay. If they're all consistent, that's fine. And we can address the 1/4 inch at another time, but at least now we know that they're all consistent. If you have blocks that are consistently a little bit smaller, which means all the way around, they're gonna measure 12 1/4 or 12 inches, something like that. That's okay. So where we run into trouble is if our seams are not consistent. So if one of our blocks is 12.5 inches on one side, but in the other direction it's 12 3/4, we have a totally different issue, right? Because if in the way that we put the block together and using a consistent seam, all the way around should be exactly the same size. So if you have a situation where your blocks are kind of more of a rectangle because they're a little bigger in one direction than they are in another, that's something that you have to address, and we're going to go back through your lessons. Maybe it's a pressing issue, it could be a 1/4 inch seam issue, and usually if you turn that block over and you actually look at the seam allowances on the back, there will be at least one seam allowance that isn't quite right. Either the two squares that you went to put together, one of them shifted a little bit and that made, you know, another 1/8 inch mistake consistently in one direction. There was a pressing issue on one block or a pinning issue on one block. Also what I found is sometimes when beginners are cutting, they get confused with the lines on the ruler, and one of their squares will be 4.5 inches, the other one will be 4 1/4, and one will be 4. And that happens a lot. So it's important really to go back and check your math, and that's why in the last lesson I had you measure your squares so you could see if you had any issues coming up, so we don't have to go back and tear anything out with our seam ripper. If you do have to change a block with your seam ripper and it's only one block, I highly recommend you go ahead and take out your seams, readjust the pieces that need to be readjusted, and sew them back together so they're all consistent. If it's every block consistently, that sounds kind of like a cutting issue, because it could be that one particular color, whether it be the A color or the B color, that somehow you have a stack that's cut in a slightly bigger size in one direction, and that can happen too. So check your seam allowances, check whether you have your two pieces of fabric together correctly when you're sewing, all those things, and all your cutting, and those things should be able to fix that problem that you're trying to solve. So in the event that you have one square or two squares, that one of them is just a little bit bigger than all the rest and you're not really sure what to do about it. Well, if we were working on a more complex block, we may run into a little bit different trouble. This block is a very simple block. So my advice then is to place your ruler in the center of the block, your big square, and you're going to trim your block to size and try as much as you can to line two sides up on a straight edge, on a straight line, and then trim your block. And in the case of this block, because it's very, very difficult for the naked eye to tell whether this center square is a 1/4 inch bigger than the outer squares, it's really difficult to tell. So if you do have a couple that are coming up oblong or just not quite the right size, you can trim a little bit of the block off. Now where this becomes a problem is if you have any triangles in your block, and let me demonstrate that for you. Okay, so the block that's in front of us is a piece from one of my other series, and you can see that in this square I have some triangles. Now if we look at how this square is constructed, we have our general squares over here. We've created a unit here, and you can see that we have these little lines here, right at the point here, which don't meet all the way at the edge. And that is our seam allowance. So if I want my point of my triangle to stick out, I have to have a seam allowance here that is at least 1/4 of an inch. So when I sew this block to the next block, I have room to be able to sew. And when I open the seam up, I still have these points. So if I were to take a square and trim off any part of this block so that it fit and was the right size, but if I tried to move this like this and come in and say trim an edge, then I'm going to take off the seam allowance that I have here, and I'm going to wind up taking off the points. So in some blocks we can do this, in some blocks it just really doesn't work. Now luckily we're not working with any triangles, so we don't have to worry about cutting off those points. And I've also seen beginners who are way more concerned with trying to get the pieces to fit and have all of the squares be consistent than they are about worrying about those end points. And this is all going to take practice. So I want you to understand that if you aren't finding that your seams are absolutely perfect to start, it's really okay. When you quilt this quilt and wash it and dry it and lay under it and love on it, whether you're with your kids or your grandchildren or a beloved relative or a family member or a friend, they're not going to be looking at your points on your triangles, okay? And it's very difficult to see them anyway after the quilt is washed. So I don't want you to feel as though you're missing out or you're not doing it right or you can't. There are lots of quilters that do it anyway. And if you look at any antique quilts, they don't always concern themselves with great points. So don't concern yourself with that to begin with. What we really want to do is try as much as we can to avoid puckering and stretching and pulling and anything that prevents your quilt from laying nice and flat. So that's the reason we're going to cut these strips now. So let's start cutting, and we'll worry about that and put these strips up on here and get started, right? So let's pretend we're working on this quilt with 9 blocks. So you can see I have my 9 blocks up here, they're separated. And then I have these sashing strips. So when I go to sew my rows together, I'm going to sew a block to a strip to a block to a strip to a block. So in each row that I have blocks, I'm going to need 2 extra strips because I have 2 spaces in between, right? The next row that I have when I go to sew this quilt together is actually going to be strips because I have to sew a strip between this row and this row in order to get that sashing done. So my next row is going to be a strip with a square, with a strip, with a square, with a strip. So this will be row 2 or row 1. This will be row 2. This will be row 3. And that's how we're going to go. Okay? So I have laid out everything. My strips are cut, but I'm going to explain to you how we're going to go about doing that. So we're going to measure all of our blocks, and we're going to come up with an average. If they're somewhere between 1/4 of an inch of each other, we're just going to come up with an average. If your blocks are a little bit bigger than 1/4, 12 and a half, if they're a little bit smaller than a 12 and a half, not quite 12 and 1/4, not quite 12 and 3/4, then you're good to go. We're going to stay with our 12 and a half inch measurement. If all of your blocks are 12 and 3/4, that's what we're going to cut our strips. And if all of your blocks are 12 and 1/4 or 12, that's what we're going to cut our strips. Okay? So in this case, we're not always going to follow the book, right? But we are in some cases. So let's take a look at the book again. Okay, so for our fabric C, which is going to be our strips, our book says that we need 4 strips that are 2.5 inches by 42. We're going to ignore the 42 number. The 42 number is what the math equals if we're going to cut them 12.5 inches. And I'm not worried about that. We're going to, if I were the pattern designer, I would have said 4.5 by width of fabric, okay, which is selvage to selvage. And then we're going to cross cut that into 12 strips. And each of our 12 strips, as the book says, is going to be 2.5 by 12.5. Now we just talked about that. We may change that measurement depending on your measurements, but for this purpose of this video, my blocks are 12.5, so that's what I'm going to cut my measurement. Hopefully everybody understands that. And then the second cutting request are 4 squares that are 4.5 inches. Now in this quilt, there are 4 cornerstones right here where the borders meet. And they are asking you to cut those same 4 squares that are 4.5 inches out of the same fabric. So if you bought the fabric the way that I stated in the beginning, that's what you're going to do. You're going to cut those strips out. We're going to subcut those strips into smaller strips that are perfectly sized for your blocks, and we're going to cut that strip that's 4.5 inches and cut our 4.5 inch blocks out of it. I'm using this fabric. This is going to be my fabric for my strips and my squares, and you can see I've already cut my strips out, but I want to show you when we go to cross cut those exactly what we're going to do. And then I also need to do, from our D fabric, I need to do 4 squares that are 2.5 inches. And our original fabric requirement was to have a 6-inch square of that solid in order to put that into the sashing right here. And so I have gone ahead and gotten a piece out of my scrap bin, and those squares are going to be 2.5 inches. So I have this little 2.5 inch leftover piece here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and count sashing squares so it makes sense to you. So in this quilt, our strips are going to be 2.5 inches wide. Mine are going to be cut 12.5. Again, yours are going to be cut whatever size you need to cut, but mine are 12.5. If I cut a piece of fabric, if my fabric is about 40 to 42 inches or so of usable fabric, if I cut a strip that is width of fabric, selvage to selvage, 2.5 inches, I'm going to be able to get 3 strips out of that strip of 2.5, and I had about this much left over. This is where the fold line was, and when I opened it up, I was able to cut. So you will fold your fabric, or you can lay your fabric out in a single strip, cut them one at a time. You'll get 3 out before you run out of strips. Okay, so why do we cut 4 2.5 inch strips? Well, we have 2 strips here. We have 3 here. So that's 5. 2 more makes 7. 1, 2, 3 more makes 10. Okay? So if I only have, oh, and I have these 2 down here. 1, 2 makes 12. So if I can only get 3 strips, 3 of these sashing strips out of a width of fabric piece, then I need 4 of those to get the 12 strips that I need. Now I added to this quilt, I added another row. So I have all of the strips that we just counted, plus I have another row like this, which is another 3, and I have 2 more, that go between the last row. So I needed 5 more strips. So if I add that 5 to the number of strips I need, right? If I needed 12 and now I need 5 more, that means I need 17. If I can only get 3 out of a strip, I need 2 extra strips to cut my pieces, right? So that's something to think about if you want to make more blocks, that you're going to need more strips of this fabric in order to make that happen. So I had to make 3 more blocks, and I need 5 more of my sashing strips in order to complete the quilt the same way. And I need 2 more of those because I have one more sashing section like this that I have to add those squares into. So I needed slightly more fabric than that. And so I've gone ahead and cut my 6 squares that are here, and I did cut my strips. What I didn't cut was my 4 cornerstone squares. So I'm going to cut those now. All right, I'm going to give myself a little bit more room on this cutting mat, and I'm going to open up my fabric. So this is how I cut my strip set. I cut my width of fabric, just thought I'd show you. So my width of fabric strip set was folded over like this. When I cut from my piece of fabric, like so, I folded it up, and I have my 2 pieces right here. And I cut my strip from that fabric, okay? And then I opened up that strip to my 2 selvages, and I laid my 2 selvages over the line on my mat. All professional quilters will tell you, never, ever, ever cut your pieces by the measurements on your mat. Only use your rulers. And that is an excellent rule of thumb, okay? The only time that becomes a bit of a challenge is when you're cutting your borders, because most of us do not have a ruler that's long enough for our borders. So that requires a lot of marking and measuring and squaring in order to get your borders out. So the mats that I have on this table are Creative Grids mats. They're really nice mats. And I have taken the ruler and measured it down on the grid work on the mat. It may not be the case for all mats, but on this particular mat, I have tested the measurements, and the measurements are correct. So I am actually measuring based on this mat. And I know that to be true because if I lay my ruler down on this mat, everything matches exactly. I took my selvages and I laid them over the line here. And then I put my fold to my right-hand side because I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, you have to go in the opposite direction. Okay, but on this one, I am right-handed, so that's what I'm going to do. I trimmed off the selvage on the line, and then I came out to my 12.5-inch measurement and I cut my piece. And these were folded over, so I cut 2 at the same time. And then I was able to open up my fabric just like so, and come down to my 12.5-inch mark, and I can cut my 3rd strip. And that's where that little piece of fabric that I showed you came from, because every time I did that, I wound up with a piece this size left over from my 12.5-inch measurement. So I have all these little scraps now. If I had started cutting from the fold side, I would not be able to do that. I would get to the end, and I would have 2 strips that were cut apart that were this size, and they would not be long enough. So that's one of those reasons why we always cut with our open to this side and our extra fabric off to the right if you're right-handed, so that you can open that fold up if necessary. So I'm going to take my ruler to my 4.5-inch measurement, and I'm going to cut my 4.5-inch strip. Okay? That's how I'm going to do it. And I didn't need to square this up because it was already square. But if it wasn't squared up, I would have needed to do that. So now I'm going to open up my fabric. And before we cut this, let me press it so it's laying nice and flat. All right, I've pressed this so it's laying a little bit more flat. We can cut it properly. So you can see how I have my fold off to the right and I have my selvages off to the left. And I can see here where my selvages end on this side and where it ends on this side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my strip past that edge line and nice and straight on this mat line. And I can just trim it off. And this gives you the idea of if I were going to cut my border strips or my sashing strips, this is exactly how I'm going to do it. Okay? So now I have a nice straight square line, and then I can cut my 4.5-inch squares, and I can measure them from my ruler itself. So I'm going to cut, this is folded over, and I'm going to cut 4.5 inches. So now I have 2 squares that are 4.5 inches. I need 4, so I'm going to go back and cut another one. And each time I cut, I'm going to make sure that my fabric is squared up nicely. So that's just a reminder of how to cut these if you're needing to cut these strips. And so cutting your sashing strips is going to be this exact same way. Also cutting your fabric into strips and squares for your D pieces are going to be exactly the same way, your little 2.5-inch squares. Okay? So now that we have everything cut, I'm going to set aside my little 4.5-inch squares because we don't need those until we go to put our borders on. And I cut those to demonstrate how we were going to do that, but you don't have to do that today. You can wait until we're doing the border lesson to be able to cut those squares. If you did cut them today, go ahead and mark them as fabric D cornerstones, because that's what they are. And that way you'll be able to, if you pin them all together, you'll be able to find them with your stuff when you're ready to put them into the quilt. All right, so now that we have finished cutting all of our strips and our squares, which I've done here, if you have space to lay it out like this, that's great. If you don't, that's okay. But this is a great way to go ahead and lay everything out so you can see what goes where. And we're going to lay it out exactly as it's laid out in the pattern. So we're going back to our pattern book. And this is where we are. We finished laying our squares out. We finished sewing our squares and pressing them. And so now we're in the assembly of the quilt top. So here's how the rows are going to go together. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one square, add a sashing strip to the side of it, just like we did with our squares for our blocks. Making sure it's lined up. We're going to sew that strip. And then we're going to sew another square to the side of it, and then another strip, and then another square, so that our row finishes like this. And then if you look at the little arrows, it says to press the seams into the underneath of our strip C. Our second row is a sashing strip, a square, a sashing strip, a square, a sashing strip, okay? So you're gonna have 2 rows that look like this, 3 rows that look like this if you're making the 3x3 quilt. And on this row, the little arrows show that we're pressing the seams out. So we're going to press towards those dark strips, okay? And that allows this line and this line to line up. So that will help to nest those seams. And that way, when we go to sew this row to this row, we'll be able to nest the seams that are right here because they will be pressed in opposite directions. And it makes it really easy because you're always pressing towards the sashing strip. This way or this way, you're always pressing towards that strip. So let's take some time, take a deep breath, and we're going to pick up our blocks and our strips, and we're going to go over and sew. And I'm going to show you the easiest way to sew a row is to start from the left side going to the right, just like we would read a book here in the States. So I'm going to pick up my blocks that way. And if I had blocks that were in a specific direction, I could grab the first one, then the next one, then the next one, and you just stack them on top of one another, take them over to your sewing machine in a stack. Now everything is laid in order that I'm going to sew it. And that'll help. It'll also help you when you get to this row. And while it may seem super obvious what we're sewing together, when we start getting into other blocks where things are turned a certain way, or one block has to be alternated with another block, or the seam looks the same but it's not quite right, we have to have some method of stacking so we don't get them twisted or turned or in the wrong order. Okay, especially when we're working with designs that have triangles that are turned a specific way. So that's a really good habit to get into, even though this is very easy to do. It's a good habit to get into. And for me, for this quilt, I'm going to continue to repeat that process all the way through all of my rows. And when I get all my rows sewn together, we're going to come back and revisit. I'm going to take my first block in my row, and then I also have my sashing strip. And I'm going to lay my sashing strip down on one end. And it's a really good idea, especially in the beginning, just pin. So I'm just going to pin. I am always in the habit of pinning at an angle so that I can pull them out with my right hand while I'm sewing. And I'm going to pin my strip down on both ends so that I know that it's nice and even. It's just a good habit to get into. You can pin on either end and ease the leftover fabric in. Now mine is measured correctly, so I'm not worried about it too much, but I am going to pay attention to what's happening with my blocks. And one of the reasons we do that is because if we start at the top and we just kind of sew all the way to the bottom and we don't pin it, then we're not aligned properly. And what can oftentimes happen is the presser foot pushes this way and the feed dogs are pulling that way, and you wind up with this little like end here that doesn't quite fit. So if you pin at the end, you'll get into a really good habit of having your machine doing the work for you, and it turns out just how you want it to turn out in the end. The other thing I want you to be aware of is underneath the block here, we have these seams, and they're going in our opposite directions. So when I just set my block down, the seam sort of caught here on this lip, and it'll turn the seam under. And so we just kind of want to make sure that our seam's going in the right direction. This is just the perfect measurement and perfect storm to get caught by that one little spot. Sorry, let me adjust my foot pedal. I can't reach it. Feeling short today. All right, I've started. I'm going to pull my pin out, and I'm just going to keep sewing. And again, I'm underneath. I'm just making sure that my seam is still going in the proper direction. And I'm going to sew my 1/4 of an inch seam. And as you're going, you're going to make sure that your fabrics are still aligned and your seam's going in the right direction. And you just keep on going until you get to the end. When I get to the end, I'm going to pull the pin out, and I'm just going to make sure that my ends stay even. So when I sew, I don't have any pushovers on the end. Okay? And then I open it up, and there's my block. And so when I get over to the iron, I'm going to press that seam under so that it's underneath the green. But for right now, I am going to sew another block. Now, if you don't feel comfortable coming in here and pressing in the correct direction, you can always put one strip down and press. So if it's difficult for you to go in and get it pressed properly, go ahead and press now. It's fine. All right, so now I'm going to lay my next block down. And again, I'm going to line up my ends to where they need to be. And because it just helps me stay in a good place and make sure that everything is sized properly. And we're just going to keep doing that until we get this row done. Now my seam is on top, and I can see whether it's folded over or not, which is great. But when they're underneath there, you really have to watch them. So here we go. I'm just pressing it underneath the foot pedal properly, making sure that it's still lined up right. So it's feeling like it was getting off a little bit. I'll just readjust. Okay, get down to the end. Going to take our pin out. And I'm just going to keep doing this until I get my row done. So since this is a beginner class, I'm going to stop and show you. One of my little ends here just kind of got drug in under the machine in our little sole plate and made a kind of a little rat's nest of thread. So I am going to rethread everything, top and bottom. So I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut off my thread, pull it through, because I don't know what's going on, but it feels as though it's just not quite, something's wrong with it. Got all kinds of thread caught up in, and I can't seem to get the thread out that I need to, which is another reason why we always want to unthread the top, because something was going on up here. It wasn't quite pulling through right. I have just little pieces of thread everywhere, and I'm going to pop the bobbin out, because the bobbin a lot of times is where things kind of get backwards and hung up. And so I'm pulling the bobbin out and rethreading that so that I know that it's threaded properly, and then I'm going to do the same thing with the top. You will not believe all the threads that I have caught on me right now because of this. All right, now that I've rethreaded the top and the bottom, I feel pretty good going forward. There we go. There's our border, or our first row of our quilt. And now we're going to do row 2, which is all sashing. So that starts with a sashing strip. This one will go a little quicker. Here, let's put our little leader in here. Okay, so what we need to do is layer a sashing strip, right sides together, with a sashing square, which we have here, making sure that it's nice and neat and even and lined up. And then we're just going to put that under the sewing machine and stitch it. Open this one up and add another sashing strip to the end of our little pink square. Right sides together, or pretty sides together. Okay, and get that together, and we'll just keep doing that with our little square and our little square, then our sashing strip, and then it'll be done. All right, so now we have all of our strips and rows, our rows done, and our sashing rows done. So we're going to pin the sashing row to our row. We're going to lay them out, and we're going to put them right sides together. And to start, we're going to start with the sashing square rows, and we're going to nest those seams right there. So we're going to pin immediately. So instead of starting at the end, we're definitely going to start right there with that seam. And that way those seams are going to align when we open this back up. So I'm going to put my pin in, nested in those seams using the same pinning technique that I showed you before. And once that's done, I'm going to go to the front, the strip on the front there, and align the strip from that seam to the corner. Okay, and we'll put a pin in there. And if you need to, you can put a pin in the middle to hold it, but we're going to make our way to the next seam that has to be aligned. And again, those seams, if you press them towards those strips, will nest. So we're going to put a pin in here again on both sets of those seams. And then once that's done, we would move on to the next one if we had one. But in this case, once this is pinned, we're going to move on to the end because that's the next part. And so we're going to make sure that the two ends are going to meet. And that way, if we have to ease anything in, it won't come over the outside. We're just easing those parts in. So if you have trouble here where the seam is a little bit loose, you can see how when I just kind of tug on it a little bit, I can walk my fingers down and I can make sure that it aligns and stays aligned. And in between the two pins, if I want to see that little bit of play in there when I lifted the two pins up, I just want to make sure that those are aligned. So I'm going to pull it taut. I'm not going to stretch it, but I'm going to pull it taut. And if I didn't do that and I just kept running the seam down along the edge of the strip, look what would happen. I could flip those over and you see how we'd have an overhang there at the end of the strip. So I don't want that overhang there at the end of the strip. To avoid doing that, we're going to match up those corners and we're going to pin there. And then that way I can take any of the over the looseness out of this strip. So I can pull that taut again. And if I need to, I can put a pin right there in the middle of the strip. But I just want to make sure that my seams are aligned and that I make sure that those little areas right there are going to meet. You can pull this a little bit taut, walk your fingers down, put a pin right in the middle so you can hold that strip together. And you need to make sure that when you sew it, that all of that stays aligned. So now we're going to take everything over to the sewing machine and taking step by step, we're going to stitch every row together. So starting with the block row, then the sashing row, block row, sashing row, so that we can sew all of those rows together. All right, so we have gotten them all done. So now we have what is essentially our main center top. So I know I've switched quilts on you, as I mentioned before. This is our black and white butterfly quilt. You may not be able to see the little butterflies in the fabric that we picked before, but in the beginning, I believe, when we did our cutting, we talked about this sort of black and white and colored group. I think maybe I talked about this when we discussed picking fabrics. So this is going to be from this is sort of a black and cream, and this will be our border print on the edge of our black and cream quilt. And so we chose our teal and orange, our teal strips and our orange squares to go with that. So this is going to be the border, and as I said before, because we picked whatever we picked here, we're going to do cornerstones. So I have those cut as well. So those are going to be our cornerstones for the border of our quilt. So we already have strips cut as it states in the book, just following the pattern for our borders and our cornerstones, but our border strips are not cut. I did not have you cut those. And so in our next lesson, we're going to talk all about borders, and we have two borders that we're going to put on. The first one is going to be the one that we have here, which is very specifically sized so that each side of the border can be cut out of one strip of fabric. All right, and then we have our quilt underneath, which is our version that I just showed you. Instead of being 3 blocks by 3 blocks, this quilt is a 3 by 4 setting. Let's grab this again. So this quilt is 3 by 4 blocks, which means that the length of the quilt will be bigger than one strip of fabric. So by doing the borders for both of these quilts in the next lesson, you'll understand how we go about cutting larger strips and sizing them down, and also why we add cornerstones and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be our lesson 7, and that will be next week, or if you're watching these in order, it'll be next week. So I hope you'll come back and join me for lesson 7 when we put the borders on our quilt. And until next time, you can join me on the web at cabinquilters.com. You can go back to our YouTube channel, watch all kinds of fun and inspiring new content, and I'll see you guys in the next one.